This evening's Dharma talk is titled Without Grasping, and good luck with that. We have to spend a lot of time looking. This is what we do as meditators. We're not trying to meditate to get to some other state, particularly. That's just more spinning around, getting from here, then that falls apart, and then we're right back where we started. But the idea is to see the way in which we grasp, to be aware of when we're rejecting things, and to see, insofar as we're able, which is quite difficult, is to see the way in which we turn away, distract ourselves, or ignore. Those are the three poisons. So if you were to see something without grasping, you would just see its elemental nature. Say if we used visual consciousness for just looking at something, looking at a person's face, you would just see the fundamental experience of visual consciousness, just light hitting an object and coming into your visual consciousness, and there would be no addition, no grasping by naming it, no grasping by rejecting it, no grasping by shutting down. And you might ask, you could ask, you probably would ask, how can ignoring be grasping? So it isn't an active kind of grasping that we think about when something arises and we attach to it. It is the kind of grasping that where we're attaching to something else. We're distracting ourselves into something else, or something arises, and rather than meeting it where it's at, which in its fundamental situation is not separate, instead we're going for some kind of separation. In other words, going away. Maybe a little bit more difficult to perceive. Sitting down facing the wall, looking at the wall, looking at how the mind comes and goes, how the thoughts come and go, and how we understand or see our grasping mind attaching to this, detaching from that. The attaching is the obvious grasping, and the detaching is more subtle. It's grasping at wanting to be rid of something, still grasping. So without grasping, in any of the sense fields, including the mind, there may be form appearing there, but it would not have a particular description, story, or elaboration. It would just be that. And the way it's talked about in the teachings is Yogacara teachings is it would be perception only. So the subject-object dynamic that is that we take for granted there. We take for granted there, and we grasp at is just perception only. It's just the perception. And even saying just perception only is a little extra. But we have to do something. Your understanding of that, you could call it your experience of that, may not cause you to immediately jump into some kind of description like, oh my, I just think I was in perception only there for a moment. You may not see it. You won't see it. You probably won't see it, and that's because you're doing it all the time. So, difficult to point that out. It's difficult to point to something that is already the case and then ask someone or suggest to someone that they see what is already the case, see through their preconceptions, their ideas, their hopes and fears about any given thing. This takes some time. This is why we have a spiritual path. It's why we have a discipline where we sit down, hold still, train the mind to see clearly by watching what's moving and without adding to it, attaching, without grasping, without any kind of grasping. It's called the middle way. Quite often when people practice, they want some kind of a progress report or something, to know I've been spending all this time facing the wall, I've been spending all of this time studying the various texts, the sutras, the Diamond Sutra, Heart Sutra, the Lanka, and we still feel difficulty, still feel suffering, still feel agitation, maybe some anxiety, maybe some, to use all of those different kinds of words describing negativity, some depression. And so the idea there is to just look at those, just look when something, rather than trying not to do something or trying to do more of something else. The idea is to just see what it is fundamentally at that time or that instant. We're trapped by the relative speech in that anytime if we understand something and we want to point to something or understand something or convey something that seems to transcend the relative situation, then we still have to use a relative language and words in order to be able to convey that. So we're in Traverse, as some of you know, on business. And so...
A couple questions.
Okay.
The first one from Junshu.
Yes.
Let's see. She asks, can there be grasping without a grasper?
There's always grasping without a grasper. We just impute. When there is grasping, there really isn't any grasper other than the one that we impute or that is created out of the incredible fecundity or spontaneous energy of life. So that grasping could happen, and just the grasping alone, just to grasp, is not a problem. So we're always going to grasp. I'm grasping a coffee cup. Seems to be the fixation that where we get in trouble, when we create more difficulty and more disease, becomes more comfortable or uncomfortable. So it seems to be necessary to observe the grasping, and then you can, if you're sitting and you're working with this teaching of perception only, you could flash on the object that's being grasped, and then flash on the so-called or imputed identity of someone who's grasping, some solid being. And again, obviously, if you have hands, just to reach for something brings it into a materialistic, it gives it an ontological or materialistic status of I'm here, here's my hand, I'm reaching for this. So we're because of our materialism or our grasping at a solid existence, everything else tends to get sucked down into that vortex of me and my stuff, me and my feelings, me and my emotions, and so on. So the grasping may go on. The example I often use for interior aggression against oneself is, I say, drop one fist. In other words, don't fight with the negativity that's arising as we're fighting with it. And so when the negativity is arising and we see that we're fighting with it, then to just take some energy away from that fight is like dropping one fist, and you still have the momentum of this going on. So it may have some circularity to it, and so this is where it seems to be necessary to just allow something to play out and watch what it does. If you're just observing, you'll notice that nothing lasts. So So if you're just observing, you're not doing anything with it, it tends to collapse. But if you're doing something with it because you're pumping energy into it by not wanting it, or by wanting it, or by shutting down on it, you set up a dynamic that is very polarized and very warlike. So I would say yes.
Shoto has a question. He asks, how does grasping show up in senses besides the mind?
The grasping shows up in what we refer to as the mind, and the mind is aligned, the sixth consciousness, using Yogacara 8 consciousness metaphor or structure. The first 5 are the ones that are basically on receive, and then the mind, the sixth consciousness, along with the 7th and 8th, mixes it up with those and coordinates that in such a way that the consciousness that is perceiving an odor, and the consciousness that is perceiving touch, and the consciousness that is perceiving sight are all the same. They're different aspects of one consciousness, and that one consciousness is imputed or imagined to be a solid, ongoing being that needs protection, needs advancement, needs and ties into wanting things to be different than they are, wanting some more of one thing, less of another thing.
Andrew down at the Battle Creek has a 2-part question.
Yes.
First, what brings us to the cushion if not grasping at increased awareness? And then secondly, is increased awareness a fine goal and the only issue is fixation on it?
So the increased awareness is always just what it is. So it's, even though I talk about strengthening awareness or increasing awareness, fundamentally awareness is just that. What happens, it gets clouded over by passion, aggression, ignorance, grasping something else. You can't actually grasp what you actually are, because that's the fundamental situation, is to grasp something else that you call me. So you're grasping at an identity that is not real. So, other part of the question?
Is increased awareness a fine goal and the only issue is fixation on it?
So we use the idea of increased awareness, and as I've said before, the awareness is always just the awareness. It's just this. And what happens is we're working on the overlay, the ignorance, the cloudiness of it, that is based on hope and fear, and is not particularly relaxed. It wants something else instead of being aligned with or right with whatever is happening. So, and I'm not sure when you say fine goal, do you mean proper goal, or is this a really good goal? Is that
he has it in quotations, the word fine.
Fine, rather than rough?
Yeah.
Okay. It also could be fine.
It could be.
Yeah, but it's not, because I know Andrew wouldn't be that tricky. What?
Shoka has a question.
Oh, did I answer, Andrew?
Oh, are you done? Oh.
I didn't think I was quite through with this yet.
You go right ahead.
What was it?
Is increased awareness a fine goal and the only issue is fixation?
That's a 2-part question, and I'm going to give a 1-part response. Yes. You can work out the details. So, interesting thing here. That's a good one, because I could say yes to that, and I can say no to that, and I can support either one. And when I say support, I'm not a logician. I don't argue with people particularly well. A few people maybe, but I don't have I'm not in love with that response particularly. Therefore, it can be either way. Go ahead.
Shoka's question?
Does he have a question?
Actually, he has 2. He had one and then he...
I want the last one first.
Okay, the last one first. Is devotion to the teacher a form of grasping or fixation?
What do you think? You hear his question?
Say it again.
He's in
Is
another
devotion.
in another world.
Is devotion to the teacher a form of grasping or fixation?
Yes and no.
She's just snuck out of that one.
Yeah.
What?
If you're looking to get something out of the situation, even if you don't realize that that's what you're doing, then yes.
Can you say it louder?
I can't repeat it. I can't remember what you said.
Yesterday, what you said in the talk that was really helpful.
What was that?
We were talking about devotion, and before I asked you about the two veils or the two obstructions to knowing, and you said emotions and conceptual knowledge, and then you said devotion is emotion, and to me the way that came out is a devotion is a way to work with emotions of passion, aggression, and ignorance, but you meet it with the same. So in a way it is grasping, but it is also a way to see through grasping. Energy of the heart.
It's not bad.
Now, do you want his first question?
Sure.
Shoka's first question was, how does the student-teacher relationship help us see grasping?
So I think there's just by putting yourself, your self-centered mind that wants something else, wants enlightenment or wants fame or wants to be a monk, putting that person, who you are, in front of a representative of the Buddhist teachings, makes it difficult for you to walk the path and turn yourself into some kind of a charlatan. That you actually, through the help of the teaching person, the teacher, the guru, whatever title you want to give that person, keeps you from getting too full of yourself. As we were just talking earlier about Marpa the translator, who with Milarepa had him build a house over here out of stone, and then as soon as he got it built, he says, "No, I don't want it there. Take it all down and build it over there. Take it all down and build it over there." This I don't know how many times he did that, either 7 times or 9 times or something. And it's the idea of I don't think necessarily that Marpa was trying to torture his student, but he saw the intense fixation and confusion that Milarepa was dealing with, and apparently, and I'm speculating here because I don't know, but apparently thought that he just needed to have some really strong disappointments happen at the hands of his teacher, so that he's asked him to be his teacher, so he's functioning as a teacher. So he begins to teach, and how does he teach? He meets him where he's at. He meets him right in the middle of his own personal ego jungle. And if a teacher can't do that, then teacher can't do that if you're comfortable around your teacher all the time, you better look for another teacher.
Junju has another question down in Battle Creek. She asks, what is the difference between grasping and attachment?
Well, the attachment, the grasping seems to have a motion to it, or implies some kind of reaching out and attaching, and the attachment seems to have some kind of maybe more stable, like an opinion is kind of frozen grasping. So you would have, you can't stand to not know whoever you are, and so you lock down on something and grasp at it, and then you freeze it, and it becomes fixation. And this is not something we do necessarily deliberately. We do it out of fear, possibly out of hope, but the other side of the hope is the fear part. We're afraid. So when to come back to what was asked about the teaching situation, that you don't want a teacher that's just going to protect you too much from what you need to see. So it's interesting that without grasping, to use the title of this particular talk, I could say a little bit more than that. Without grasping, whatever the sense consciousness that's operating, we won't know exactly what it is. The ego doesn't like that, so it will quickly come up with something, think of something, invent something. It will spin. If it's go to almost any of the sense consciousness and find some kind of spinning instead of just a state of not doing anything with it, not knowing anything, and not insisting on some kind of a name or some kind of a description or some kind of an evaluation about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
So Shoto had a question, but I think it was similar to maybe Junshu's one.
Okay.
He asks, when does grasping become fixation?
Well, you could probably talk about it different ways, but it's that kind of a situation where we're fixed and we no longer investigate. If you come to any conclusion, I sometimes say include as some kind of an activity or attitude, but don't conclude. And obviously, maybe not so obviously, but it looks obviously we're going to conclude things just spontaneously. We're driving along and we see something moving in front of our vehicle. Could be a deer or something like that. We come to a conclusion right away about that. So we're not saying you would never do that. It's just that having an attitude of including as much as possible seems to be helpful. If you're concluding something with the motivation to get somewhere or be somebody or support yourself or move yourself into some kind of a higher level of being or understanding or even towards awakening, then Buddhahood, then when you conclude things, like if you conclude that you're awake, which occasionally I have people sit in front of me and tell me they're awake. Why is that funny?
It just seems funny.
It is quite funny. I never laugh though. Well, there's that one time I laughed at that one person. Awakening is not a conclusion. It's not even an inclusion. It's not separate. And not separate is actually saying too much about it. But since I'm sitting here and there's the Buddha sitting over here, the example of the Buddha, and there are Buddhist students here and apparently on there, and I'm functioning as a teacher, then that's what I'm going to say. This conclusion about anything does this, because you stop looking at that. This is why it's called Buddhism. Buddha comes from the root word Bud, Sanskrit, which means awake, as far as I know, unless some history is have some of that history off. As far as I know, that's fairly close. And so, if you're awake, then if there's awakening, if there's awareness there, then there probably isn't going to be many conclusions.
Another question from Shoto, is knowing concluding?
I mean, like when you say no, 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 that kind of knowing. No, no, no. Don't do that. That?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Andrew has another question.
Shoot.
He asks, is grasping solely in the seventh consciousness?
The motivation or the wish for something else is in the seventh consciousness. The actual activity involves all of the consciousnesses. And it can. It isn't separate from touch necessarily. It isn't separate from the sixth, and it isn't separate from the eighth. So all of those are included, and tangentially, possibly the sense of hearing or smelling may be involved in there a little bit. But basically, the sixth, seventh, and eighth are the ones, just like just like the skandhas function the same way. Sometimes more in one area than in another.
A little bit earlier today, you had said that you're not concerned about results. Could you say something about what that means?
Yeah, it's quite humorous to be working with cause and effect all the time, and yet and be really engrossed. I'm trying to respond to your question. Be really engrossed and really looking at all of that, but know that any kind of an outcome is extra in terms of imputing something or grasping at something. There's not a word for this, and they've come up with all kinds of words for it. One of the words they come up with is bliss, because it's just a deep kind of calm that is not separating itself. This does not mean that the person who has an understanding or has some kind of connection, you could say, with this, which not exactly a connection. It doesn't mean that there isn't positive, negative, neutral going every which way all the time. It's just that there's no one home. So therefore there's just this. So there's kind of a you don't want anything else. You just want, if you want anything, you just want this. And yet this is always changing. So you don't want something else. Even though it's presented, even though it's discussed, the topic we were discussing earlier is just humorous. It's just funny. Not so much ha-ha funny, but like cause and effect are no longer separate from each other. The equality of sameness and difference of Sandokai teaching and all of the teachings in the Buddhism it's just like when the teaching of no self is there because people are attached to a self. But actually there's a self.
What is that self? What is that?
Buddha nature.
Could you say how it differs from what we would think of normally as a self?
Yeah, it doesn't want anything.
Does it have a locality?
Everywhere. Might be localized in a form, but it's so temporary. There isn't anywhere that it isn't at. I'm not saying it's in Houston, and there's some in there, and there's some in it. It's not that kind of locality, but it's like the alligator in the kitchen. I'm using that kind of idea. It's everywhere. It's in every kitchen. I'm happy to go into that deeper, but there has to be a question that takes us into that in a deeper way, not just over there, is it over there, over there, is it here, is it there? Go ahead.
I'm not sure.
That's a pretty good statement.
Andrew's question, there's grasping in the eighth.
Is that a statement? there's grasping in the
Well,
eighth.
he has a question mark at the end.
Oh, that's a question mark, okay. To use the metaphor of the eighth, there is no, there's just vasanas, or there's just, these concepts are only going to go so far. But no, there's not. Grasping. The grasping situation is, well, it's in my hand if I reach for the coffee cup, and it's in my 6th, 7th, and 8th, because the 8th is not separate from any of this. So the 8th is always receiving the perfume, or I should say cologne, from the 6th, 7th, and all the other senses. Everything is always flowing up to that, and then things, if they're triggered, are flowing back down. But it's not a matter of grabbing something or fixating on something. It's just the way the structure. It's just the nature of a dependent origination. And when the 7th consciousness is to continue to stretch this metaphor, when it no longer is wants something else, then it's been said that there's a turning about in the basis of consciousness, of the alaya vijnana, where there's the alaya is emptied. It doesn't mean the alaya is emptied. It's just no longer a separate situation. I need to study French.
Shoto's question, is there identification with the self you're describing?
So, speaking of Buddha nature, is that what? There's no identification. You don't think of yourself as identifying with anything. Goes on.
Language, it seems, it's a symbol for what you're trying to describe, and as soon as you go into the language or the symbol of what you're talking about, you've left the situation. So how can you use language to encourage looking at the situation without distracting from it more?
It's what I tried to do. I do the best I can. Like using the sutras, using like Sandokai, the equality of sameness and difference. It's pointing at, it's using a relative construct to point at the ultimate. So all you can do is use the teachings to point that direction, and sometimes meeting someone, depending on what they ask you, what they say, how they relate to you. If they don't really relate to you as a teacher, and they're pretending on some level. I'm not saying they're deliberately being deceptive, but they're. I know about this because I did it. I did it with both my teachers, and I got the message back. It was very uncomfortable to know that someone can see what you're doing. On the other hand, maybe that's how the teaching needs to function. So in my situation, I talk a lot. So a couple times a week. Of course, I spent 30 years not talking, not particularly teaching. Even when I did a meditation interview back 30 years ago, which I was doing back then, I still was very careful not to overstep, you could say, my position as a meditation instructor. I might make some suggestions if someone had a lot of difficulty. I would say, maybe you need to talk to Rinpoche, but I wouldn't try to, even if if I had some insight into it, I wouldn't do much in that area. So it's about practicing the two ways, stretching the two wings of the bird, stretching the awareness so you have some intuition happening, and stretching the conceptual mind so you have an intellectual grasp of what you're starting to see. As I said a few days ago, and Sokuzan and I have talked a little bit about this recently. If you see what this is before you're ready for it, it can be very, very difficult. Unless you really work with some of the grasping on a really fundamental level, where you're grasping at something and grasping at something and grasping at something, and you work with that fundamentally. Because if you're hiding out from that when the big samadhi comes along, and suddenly you're dumped into reality with all of your passion, aggression, ignorance, and your hopes and fears all banging into each other, that could be very, it might sound very very seductive to hear you can actually function with no self. And you can function and not know where you're at, what you're doing, who you are, and what a building is. Just the name only rises when you need to have a name, and the rest of the time you're in an open dimension of being that is without self, without other. Sometimes it's called nothing happens. Sometimes it's called suchness. Even though there's motion, if there's no separation, then this motion compared to everything else is motionless. So I think we were talking about might be a good idea to go slow. Yes.
Shoto wants to know what's a self without identity.
Oh, Shoto. Let's see. So it's the same thing as identity without a self. Only it's different. But I might get a better answer there. No, I'm not going to get a better one. It's the best I can do.
Sato wants to know why French.
Because then I'd be able to study existentialism in its original. I could read Jean-Paul Sartre, I could read Albert Camus, and I could see what they really were saying instead of what the translators think they were saying. No, actually, I'm just, Sato, you already know.
And she has a smiley face.
Yeah, she does.
A grin with teeth.
I could have said almost anything. French is nice. I have a French student. Perhaps she's watching. Yes.
Junshu asks, how do we work with seeing that we want something else and then not wanting that? In other words, not wanting to want something else.
Yeah, it's not about changing that. It's not about, it's only about the awareness. It's about awakening to that, and that tends to have stages or layers or something. I don't know how it would work with everyone, but the way it worked here is the closer I tended to get to some kind of deep understanding about it, the less I knew about what was happening. And instead of going backwards and trying to grasp at concepts that would support what it was apparently showing up in front of me, I just said, I don't know if I said it, I'm just going to go on without it. I don't need a compass. I don't need a GPS. I don't need anything. I don't need anything. And so, but how that feels to ego is, well, then you're not going to get anywhere because you're not going to know where you're going. You've wasted all this time, and here you are going to wander off into the swamp. Or the other image, metaphor that's probably more specific is here's the cliff, now jump. And as has been said before, and I'll say again because it's a wonderful metaphor, yes, you do fall. You just don't land. Don't land anywhere. There is no ground to this. It's an open dimension of being, which is Herbert Gunther back in the 60s and 70s. That's the way he described awakening.
Andrew asks, how is giving up grasping?
Well, giving up translates into some kind of someone who's given up, and so it's a form of grasping on an identity of wanting to be one who has given up. So, yeah, good question. Yes.
He has another question. How do we connect the intellect and the insight?
You don't have to connect them. They're not separate. But we need to train separately. Train over here for the intellect, train over here. At some point, the intuition and the thinking process get along wonderfully well. Sometimes you're thinking, sometimes just awareness, sometimes there's an open dimension, sometimes everything shuts down, but there's no one who is either enhanced by it or threatened by it. And if there is someone who's threatened, you see it's unreal. If you have thoughts of paranoia, you see they're unreal. But you don't try to stop, or you don't make assumptions. Oh, I'm having thoughts of paranoia. Maybe I'm not as clear as I thought I was. So that's the tricky part. You know what I'm saying? Yes.
What's the difference between observing thoughts and thinking?
Same thing. Keep coming. That's good. Actually, my response was good.
So
Your
what's
question
the
was
difference
okay.
between observing thoughts and I don't know. Oh, that's hard.
Wasn't that amazing? What happened?
There is nothing to.
Nothing to say about that, is there? Yeah. You're not separate. This is the thing that's so the common thing is mind-blowing or outrageous about the truth is it's completely ordinary. And it's so ordinary that you can't do anything with it. And so therefore you're just, it's like you're just flat-footed. And even though you're a runner, not to.
Can you be thinking without knowing you're thinking?
We do that all the time. Thinking, not thinking. Thinking, now I'm thinking that I'm not thinking. I'm thinking that I'm thinking I'm not thinking, but I'm still thinking. And then there was that one time when I thought I wasn't thinking, and I actually wasn't thinking. But then I thought about it. And then it just screwed it all up. And I didn't get any credit. It's disappointing. One after another. Disappointing, 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 disappointing. Falling apart, falling apart, falling apart, falling apart. Yes. No? Are we at the end of our preliminary hearing? Yes.
If we've spent a long time ignoring incessant thinking, and then there's awareness of thinking, and it seems like the thinking is getting more pronounced, how can you work with thinking when it's relentless?
It's getting more pronounced just means you're more and more aware of how much of that's been going on. So it's not doing thinking, not doing anything. It's just thinking. And then the awareness gets really clear about all of that thinking process. Thinking it's like wheels on a saltine cracker box. I mean, why would you put wheels on a cracker box? But we do it. We think up things.
So
like I just did.
the wheels on the saltine cracker box, that vision, it moving or
What
doing
color
it,
are the wheels?
red.
Green.
Too bad for you.
You mean too bad for you or for me?
Yeah, for you.
Oh,
Red's better
yeah, it is better.
for wheels.
I would agree. You got me there.
So if the vision's doing whatever it does, or
Yeah.
random images, is that thinking?
Yes.
Any phenomena of consciousness is thinking?
Now, phenomena in consciousness has that kind of component to it. Otherwise, we couldn't make an altar. We couldn't move. We couldn't do anything. So we're downloaded. The awareness, the consciousness is downloaded into this form so that we can learn, so that we can understand what this is, who we are, what this is really about. Any other questions? None online? Well, wonderful. Everybody can go to bed now.
We can dedicate the mirror.
Let's dedicate the mirror. I won't stand up. I'll sit down and do it.
Do you want to do it without?
Yeah, go ahead. However you want to do it. I'm just gonna sit down and do it.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Jiho san chi shi hu shi son gu sa mo ko sa mo ko ja ho ro mi. The 10 directions, the 3 worlds, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna Paramita,